Morning all. It was the news we'd all been waiting for. The Prime Minister has called it a one-way road to freedom. The plans for easing us out of lockdown over summer have now been revealed. But how will unlocking at each stage affect coronavirus cases? And will we end up seeing vaccine passports being brought in to help us get back to a more normal way of life? We'll be asking the Health Secretary shortly. First, our Chief Political Correspondent John Craig reports.
OK, so tell me a little bit more about it, Cameron.
Boris Johnson's 4 steps to freedom start with children in England back to school next month. Then an alfresco April in beer gardens, pubs and restaurants opening their doors in May, and England's lockdown restrictions continue until at least June.
We're now travelling on a one-way road to freedom, and we can begin safely to restart our lives and do it with confidence.
But can he guarantee no more U-turns?
I can't guarantee that it's going to be irreversible, but the intention is that it should be irreversible. And that's why we're going in the way that we are. That's why we're taking the steps that we are.
And warnings that COVID could be part of life for years to come.
The vaccination will take the rates right down, but they will not get rid of this. And this is something we have to see for the long term. And in my view, is likely to be a problem, in particular in the winter, for the next few winters.
It may be necessary next winter to have things like mask wearing in certain situations, making sure that if we get the sorts of symptoms that we know are associated with COVID, we stay off work.
Some Tory MPs complain the lockdown is being lifted too slowly.
Today's pace of change will be a hammer blow for aviation, for pubs, for restaurants, hotels, gyms and pools, the arts and the establishment. Once again, it seems to be modelling, not data, which is driving the government's decisions.
To help reopen the economy, the government is considering whether people should have to show a COVID certificate or vaccine passport to attend big events like concerts or sports fixtures. Mr Johnson says the end of England's lockdown is in sight.
Is your roadmap too cautious, Prime Minister?
But it remains a long road to freedom. John Craig, Sky News.
And the Health Secretary, Matt Hancock, joins us once again on the programme. Good to see you this morning, Mr Hancock. A very big day yesterday. Yeah, and it is a good morning, isn't it? There is, I think, for many people, a light at the end of the tunnel. Just in terms of the roadmap, we do understand, of course, there are always differences of opinion around the Cabinet room table. Different ministers have different emphases. This roadmap feels like it does have an awful lot of influence from yourself, from the Department of Health. I mean, this is pretty much what you were looking for, wasn't it?
Well, you would expect the Department for Health to have an impact on the roadmap for coming out of a pandemic, but actually there was remarkable levels of unanimity in government. Of course, it's totally normal to have debates, in this case, largely around the details, because we're all absolutely determined to come out of this as fast as safely possible, but no faster. And the safety is important, and we're determined, as the Prime Minister puts it, that this should be irreversible. That is the goal. And then it's a judgment about how much we can lift at what moment. But it's not just a judgment for us, it's actually on everyone. And this is one of the points I want to stress, is that this isn't just about choices the government makes. It's actually about how everybody responds and pulls together. So for now, it is so important that people stick to the existing rules. We can see the light at the end of the tunnel. And the best way to get there is for everybody to keep abiding by the rules as they are in very, very large part. And then as we release things, we need to move at that pace, because that is what we expect to be the safe way to get out of this as fast as we can as we roll out the vaccine programme, because all of this is only possible because of that rollout.
Indeed, and I want to kind of quiz you a little bit more deeply about the vaccine efficacy, because great data from Chris Whitty yesterday. I think plenty of people will have sat up straight at that point. But in terms of the pace of relaxation, it strikes me, you heard from Steve Baker just a moment ago, demanding that perhaps we could move quicker. Under the scheme, under the roadmap as announced, it doesn't look like actually there is any scope for moving any quicker because of that 5-week gap between the steps.
Well, that's right. It's very, very important that we can see the impact of one step before taking the next step. And now there are some. There's just a vital need to keep watching the data, and for all of us, and I mean everybody watching and the whole of society, to stick with this plan. We want to be able to hit those milestones, but we'll be vigilant and watch what's happening to make sure it's safe to make each move. And the Prime Minister set out the 4 tests that we will apply before announcing that each move can go ahead. But of course, we want to make the moves at the dates that are set out. But it's on all of us to make sure that we can, by continuing to follow the rules between now and then, as the vaccine rollout continues and as the really, really positive impact of those vaccines takes effect. This is on all of us.
A key aspect of this is, of course, moving out on a national rather than a regional basis. Do you think people like Steve Baker will ultimately accept that? I understand the rationale for it, but, for example, if we saw cases rising in and around London, meaning that, people in Devon and Cornwall couldn't see restrictions relaxed in their area. Do you think that people, first of all, in Devon and Cornwall would accept that, whether people in your party would accept that?
Well, we have seen actually that the rates went up right across the country, and then in this national lockdown have been coming down right across the country, more so than previously, actually. Now, there are some parts of the country, very small targeted areas, where we find new variants that we're worried about, the new variants that might not be dealt with in the same way by the vaccine. And we've put in particular measures in those localised areas, for instance, some around Bristol, around Woking, around Sefton in Merseyside. But that's very much the exception. The goal here is that we all move together across England, and Nicola Sturgeon's setting out the path for Scotland, and the Welsh and Northern Irish administrations will set out their path. But essentially, across England, a national approach we think is the right one, yeah.
Clearly, it does feel that those variants may well be the stumbling point, or at least the point that they may result in the pause button being hit. I'm just wondering what the government's modelling is telling us, what this kind of roadmap, the relaxation, will do as regards the South African variant, the Brazilian variant.
Well, the good news is that the number of new variant cases we're finding across the whole UK is falling, and has fallen quite sharply over the last month. And in the last a week or so, there were just over a dozen new cases, which is far smaller than we were seeing even a couple of weeks ago. So the extra measures that we're taking at the border are working. And also the lower case rate makes it much less likely that there'll be new variants here, because new variants tend to arrive when you've got an area that's got a very high case rate and the virus is trying to escape from the immunity that people are getting naturally. Now, we need to do continued work to understand how effective the vaccines are against these new variants. We now know that the vaccines are extremely effective in the real world, in the UK right now, against the main variant here, the so-called Kent variant. That is what is the vast majority of cases here are. But we do have to protect against these new variants, and that is a big challenge. One of the reviews announced yesterday is a review into international travel, and that review will be informed by the evidence that we're currently collecting on the impact of the vaccine on the so-called South Africa and Brazil new variants. If the vaccine works well against them, then we can be much more relaxed about international travel. If the vaccine doesn't work against them, then that will be much, much more difficult.
Just in terms of, we mentioned it before, fantastic data in terms of vaccine efficacy. And indeed, you and I spoke a few weeks ago, and there was a hint already at that point that there was data confirming that. Do we have enough information yet on what effect the vaccines are having on transmissibility?
Well, the evidence published by Public Health England yesterday demonstrate that there is a reduction of around 70% in your chance of catching the virus, and there's obviously a link from that to transmissibility. If you don't have the virus, then you can't easily transmit it, obviously. And then an even bigger impact in terms of death and hospitalisation. So this is a really, really good result. You know, I had confidence that we'd get a vaccine. I have huge confidence in the NHS to roll out the vaccine, and it's wonderful to see the effect of the vaccine saving lives in the UK right now, not just in a lab, not just in a trial, but the vaccines are saving lives right now. And you can see the result in the real world data as well, because if you look at the number of people who are dying each day, that number is falling sharply. It's actually falling more sharply than it was even a couple of weeks ago. So the halving rate of deaths is accelerating. And that's despite the fact that the halving rate of hospital admissions is holding steady. So this is real world information showing that the vaccines are working to save lives in the UK right now. And that obviously is incredibly encouraging.
Yeah, very encouraging indeed. Can we talk about business? I mean, we've obviously heard a number of times the government stands ready to do whatever it takes to protect livelihoods and businesses. Of course, the roadmap published yesterday sets out a route all the way till the tail end of June. You know, if I'm a small, medium-sized business owner this morning, it wouldn't be daft for me, would it, to assume that furlough business rates relief is going to be extended till the end of June as well?
Well, you tempt me, no, but that's very much a matter for the Chancellor, and he'll be setting out.
But we could do a hearing from him right now, couldn't we? Now that we've had the roadmap, I understand the budget is in a week's time, and I see you smiling there. But you know, there maybe will be business owners watching this who are perhaps not so sanguine about the fact they have to wait another 7 days to know.
Well, look, I understand that. And coming from a small business background myself, I entirely understand the impact of this on small businesses. And it's been devastating for some and difficult for most. And the level of economic support that the government's put in is both unprecedented and bigger than almost anywhere else in the world. And the Chancellor is going to set out more details next week.
Can we dwell for a second, Health Secretary, on the judgment handed down by the High Court last week? And a lot of ground has been gone over. I'm not asking you for an apology. I'm not asking whether or not you're going to resign. I do think it's worthwhile asking, though, whether you understand why there are quite so many people concerned about the procurement process. There is an opaque quality to it. A number of contracts have been awarded to people that you and others within government have personal relationships of some form or another with. Do you understand why? And I get the rationale for why you had to operate in this way. I understand your position. But do you also understand that perhaps in the not too distant future, people would like to know that all of those contracts have been awarded in a proper way? Would you be accepting of the possibility of an independent inquiry, getting the transparency on your department that a lot of people are after?
Well, that transparency is there. So the good news is that there already has been an inquiry into this by the National Audit Office, and they published their results, which found that there wasn't a problem with any of the individual contracts. And indeed, this court case wasn't about the individual contracts.
They also refused to rule out criminal abuse.
If I just answer the question, you asked for transparency. The only reason that people know about these contracts is because of the transparency rules that we rightly have in place. And because we published all of the details, now we published them around, on average, a couple of weeks late. And that's what the court case was about. But it wasn't about the substance of the contracts, because that's already been looked into by the National Audit Office. And all of them have stood up to scrutiny. Now, people then say, but hold on, some people you knew got contracts. Well, are you saying that if you know a minister, then you shouldn't be allowed to have contracts? So I didn't personally...
but perhaps there might need to be a little bit more scrutiny.
Well, there's been enormous amounts of scrutiny, and as this conversation attests, and the reason that we can have this discussion is because we have that transparency. And the contracts in question, I didn't have personal involvement in the signing of the individual contracts. But sure, what I did do is make sure that my team were given all the support they could to buy PPE to save lives. And, we as you say, we have been through this. And I think, the argument that I'm making is the argument that not only anybody in my position would have made and would have done, but also it's what the public expect, right? They'd expect me as Health Secretary to ensure my team had all the support they possibly could.
You can't have it both ways. I mean, the judge in the case said that the history of these proceedings is unedifying. The lion's share of the blame lies with the Secretary of State, lies with you. £200,000 was spent on legal fees for a case that didn't need to happen because you could have simply said, yes, we were in breach.
Well, it's absolutely true that the case didn't need to happen because it was it hasn't had any material impact. So you'll have to ask the people who brought the case why they did that.
To get you to accept that you were in breach. As the judge said, I have no doubt the claim has speeded up compliance.
But we accepted in full that these things were published a fortnight late. That isn't in dispute. What we argued we argued a public interest defence. It's in the national interest that we did what we did. And my team, who are an amazing group of people, worked incredibly hard to save lives. And that's what we do in the health department. And sure, if we weren't able to put the paperwork in on time, in normal times, of course we put the paperwork in on time. But in the middle of a global pandemic, you don't. So you can ask me as many questions as you like. You're not going to change my view. And if I had my time again, absolutely, I'd do exactly the same thing, even if it led to this conversation. Because what I care about is making sure that people have the protection they need. And I care deeply about the staff of the NHS and the staff who work in social care. And I care deeply that they have everything they need. And it was really tough. But there wasn't a national shortage at any point. There were difficulties in individual areas, but there was never a national shortage. And that's because of the work that my team did. And I'm very, very proud of them.
Mr. Hancock, I would love to keep asking you questions. Unfortunately, I have to let you go. Health Secretary, thanks for coming on. Tom Rayner joins us once again in the studio. Tom, obviously a huge amount of work ongoing in terms of getting us out of all of this. What leapt out to you?
Well, I think Matt Hancock was pretty defensive, not just on that last issue around transparency around procurement, but also defensive of the pace of the roadmap that was set out yesterday. I think this is going to be a major point of tension with Conservative backbenchers, particularly as things develop. If things continue to go in the right direction, potentially we're going to see those tensions increase. But Matt Hancock confirmed that for those arguing that the government should be able to move faster if the data allows it, the answer was pretty clear, that the 5-week gap in between the stages that were set out is pretty rigid, that that's not going to change. And I thought what was also revealing, Neil, is that right at the start of that interview, the Health Secretary felt the need to stress that this was not just about government decisions, but about individual decisions, and implying, and I think in a revealing way, that the government is now concerned that having set out a programme, despite all their efforts to emphasise that these are the earliest possible moments that things can happen, inevitably every single newspaper is full of dates. People will have been messaging one another saying, well, I think we can do this from May the whatever. And I think it was revealing that the Health Secretary showed some nervousness that actually once you start letting your foot off the brake, that people might start going beyond what is allowed by the rules.
Yeah, for a data, not date strategy, there are certainly plenty of dates in it. Tom, thanks very much indeed. Well, let's take a closer look at the government's proposed route out of lockdown. From the 8th of March, all schools will reopen and after-school activities will be allowed. 2 people can meet in a public space like a park, and care home residents will be allowed a regular visitor who can hold their hand. The rule of 6 is to be reintroduced on the 29th, allowing outdoor gatherings of 6 people or 2 households. Organised sport will return and you will be allowed to travel out of your local area, but encouraged to stay local. Domestic self-catered holidays could be allowed as soon as after the Easter break from April the 12th. Non-essential retail also due to reopen at this point, including hairdressers and beauticians, pubs, restaurants. Well, they should be able to reopen their outdoor areas. Public buildings like libraries and museums, along with zoos, will be able to open their doors. People might be able to sit in pubs and restaurants if things go well from May the 17th. Theatres, cinemas also reopening at this time. Up to 30 people could be allowed to attend weddings, christenings and funerals. And as many as 10,000 fans could be allowed into football stadiums. Fast forward all the way to June the 21st, the government planning then to be able to remove all legal limits on social contact. It will also review social distancing rules, including face masks and working from home. But this roadmap, as we've been saying, only gives the earliest possible date for each stage. Progress is reliant on 4 tests, which must be met before the next step can be taken. They are the continued success of the vaccine programme, evidence that vaccines are reducing hospitalisations and deaths, infection rates not surging, and that the risks don't change due to variants of concern, something we're just discussing with the Health Secretary. Well, of course, some businesses in Birmingham have been closed since last March and are worried about what the future holds, even with this roadmap out of lockdown. Sky's Becky Johnson reports.
Life as we knew it is still a distant prospect. Foreign holidays, clubbing, festivals, normality, still months away. The route out of lockdown will be slow and cautious.
There will be at least 5 weeks between each step.
This chef in Birmingham had been hoping for better news. He now needs the new outdoor seating area to be finished by April because they won't be serving anyone inside until at least the middle of May.
I think anybody in the hospitality industry would tell you the same thing. They feel like they've got the short end of the stick when they've put all the precautions in place, done everything they can do to make it COVID secure.
The stillness of shuttered nightclubs is in stark contrast to the vibrant venues they once were. The last time dance floors were full was last March. They'll have been closed for at least 15 months by the time we next see scenes like these. But the fact they're even included on the list of things that could reopen from the 21st of June gives an industry that's been shut for so long some optimism.
It has seemed like a never-ending nightmare, to be honest, and it seemed very bleak. It's been beyond tough, and it's tested our resolve to the absolute maximum, and it's been very dark. I'm not going to lie, it's been tremendously crushing.
There's disappointment too for anyone hoping for a haircut soon. Hairdressers won't be opening until at least the 12th of April. The owner of this salon got a new puppy to help her cope through the long winter months. She had hoped to be back at work sooner.
It feels quite far away, and I think this lockdown's been really hard on everybody's mental health, I think. But definitely looking forward to the 12th. The sooner the better.
After so many months of restrictions, there's now at least hope that better times are coming. Becky Johnson, Sky News, Birmingham.
A bit of breaking news now on jobs, just reaching us in the last few minutes. Let's speak to our business correspondent, Paul Kelso. Morning, Paul. What are we learning? This is about employment.
These are the latest employment statistics from the Office for National Statistics released this morning, which show that unemployment has risen again in the quarter, the 3 months between December and February, to 5.1%. That's 1.3% higher than a year ago, and although it is down 0.3% on the quarter before that. So it shows the continued impact, creeping impact on the employment market of the coronavirus and the protracted shutdown that we're into. Now, a few other rather grim figures from the release, Neil, if I may. The payroll, number of people on payrolls is down 726,000. That's fewer people registered for PAYE. There are more than 700,000 people, more people unemployed than there were before the coronavirus outbreak. And a new statistic from the ONS this morning, almost 60% of that number are people aged under 25. So a disproportionate impact on the young. And of course, many of them learned today with the roadmap that their prospects of employment in hospitality and leisure and such like have not improved. They can't think about these places reopening and offering them a job until April at the earliest.
Paul, many thanks. The former First Minister of Scotland, Alex Salmond, has claimed he's been the victim of a malicious and concerted attempt to see him removed from public life. The claims were made in documents submitted to the Scottish Government Committee investigating the handling of harassment complaints involving Mr Salmond. Sky Scotland correspondent James Matthews has the latest.
There was a lot of talk, about bombshell evidence to be unveiled by Alex Salmond. Well, this does exactly what it says on the tin. Let me just read you some of what he has put in this submission. He says, this is him talking about what the SNP and he says members of the Scottish Government tried to do to him. The evidence supports a deliberate, prolonged, malicious and concerted effort amongst a range of individuals in the government and SNP to damage my reputation, even to the extent of having me imprisoned. He points the finger at Peter Murrell, Chief Executive of the SNP and husband of Nicola Sturgeon. He says that he went around recruiting senior members of staff to find other members of staff to go to the police and make complaints about him. He says other things in this written submission. He talks about a judicial review, a legal action that he took against the government because of their handling of the investigation into them. He says that he reckons there was legal advice, they were going to lose that, but for months, at great expense to the taxpayer, the government kept that action going. Nicola Sturgeon was involved in at least one meeting. Huge cost. He says the reason they strung it out was because they were hoping he would get arrested first and the judicial review and the illegality of it would disappear behind the screen of criminal action, his arrest, and so on. So very serious allegations being made by Alex Salmond. In response, the SNP has said these are just more assertions, in their words, without a shred, they say, of credible evidence. Alex Salmond will give evidence to a Holyrood harassment committee on Wednesday, to be followed a week later by Nicola Sturgeon. It will be box office. It could potentially be extremely damaging for the SNP.
Let's have a look at a couple of the day's other stories now. And Facebook has announced it will restore news content to its users in Australia after the government amended laws that would force the platform to pay media companies. Australia and Facebook have been locked in a standoff for more than a week as Canberra pushed ahead with the measure aimed at tech giants like Facebook and, of course, Google. The wife of the notorious drug kingpin Joaquin El Chapo Guzman has been arrested over her alleged involvement in international drug smuggling. The former beauty queen, Emma Coronel Ispuro, was a regular attendee at her husband's trial 2 years ago. She was arrested at Dulles Airport in Northern Virginia and will appear in federal court in Washington later. Her 63-year-old husband is currently serving a life sentence after he was convicted of trafficking tons of drugs into the US. Music streaming platforms Spotify, Apple and Amazon will face questions in a Digital Culture and Media Select Committee hearing today. It's the final day of evidence for the inquiry into the economics of streaming. Despite offering a global platform, the majority of proceeds from streams rarely make it to the artists. Time to see how the weather is looking this morning. Isabel is standing by at the screen with the details. Well, I can see quite a lot of rain over your shoulders there. That's worrying.
Yeah, the southerly wind also making it feel very mild. It'll be a very mild 24 hours, but rain really the big story. So let's take a look at the warnings.
Look forward to brighter skies. The weather, sponsored by Qatar Airways.
So from midday, the Met Office has this amber warning in force for heavy rain for central and southern Scotland, where some places could see between 80 and 120 millimetres worth of rain. So substantial amounts falling on saturated ground, bringing the threat of flooding. It's windy as well, with gusts up to about 60, maybe even 70 miles an hour for some exposed northern and western areas. And you can see that contrast then. Whilst it's wet and windy across the north and west, it's much drier and brighter the further south and east you go, with temperatures in London probably up to about 14 Celsius, 57 Fahrenheit. And we keep that contrast as we head through this evening and tonight as well. The rain easing a little bit more from Ireland and central Scotland, and it's settling itself a little bit more through Cumbria, Lancashire and down through Wales into the southwest. Still gusty as well. A very mild night for all of us, 10 or 11 degrees. And then that rain sits across the west here of England and Wales throughout Wednesday. Southeastern areas mild and bright. Northwestern areas cheering up as well with some sunshine. And as the rain clears through the south on Thursday, many more of us settle down.
The weather, sponsored by Qatar Airways.
Isabel, thank you. As usual, let's remind ourselves as to the latest data we have for coronavirus in the UK. 10,641 new confirmed cases of COVID-19 were recorded in the most recent 24-hour period. A further 178 people have lost their lives within 28 days of testing positive. That brings the UK total to 120,757. And 17.72 million first doses of the vaccine have been administered. Well, just a few minutes ago, I was speaking with the Health Secretary, who had some news about the spread of the COVID variants.
The number of new variant cases we're finding across the whole UK is falling, and has fallen quite sharply over the last month. And in the last a week or so, there were just over a dozen new cases, which is far smaller than we were seeing even a couple of weeks ago. So the extra measures that we're taking at the border are working.
There's a call for more support for struggling companies and workers during the phased relaxation of lockdown. The Prime Minister has promised not to pull the rug from under those hardest hit by the pandemic, but has deferred details of future economic support to the budget. We're joined now on the programme by Tony Danker, Director General of the Confederation of British Industry. Tony, great to have you on this morning. No doubt you have pored over that 60-page roadmap to freedom, as some have called it, very, very closely indeed. What do you make of it?
Well, look, good morning. I think it is definitely a welcome step forward, and it comes on the back of some good news medically you've just cited, and also obviously the great success of the vaccination programme. The big judgment call here was to go slower in a more managed way in order to avoid the stop-start of lockdowns of the last year. And I think, broadly speaking, business will welcome that. I think business will also welcome, by the way, schools going back first. Not only is that good for our children, but it's good for the economy. We learned in the last year that great enablers of the economy, like schools being open and transport operating, are key to economic success. So I'm sure we'll come on to talk about some of the sectors that aren't overly happy and are quite concerned this morning. But in broad terms, I think it's really a welcome step forward.
Well, let's dive straight on into it then, Tony. I mean, who this morning is waking up feeling particularly dissatisfied with that which they heard from the PM?
Yeah, look, I think the hospitality sector, clearly, this is later than they would have hoped for. You have to remember these businesses have been out for a long time. They also missed the golden quarter at the end of last year, which was hugely important to their cash flow. I also think the aviation sector is something we've got to watch incredibly closely. People understand, I believe, why there are travel bans in place or airport closures and bans in place and the quarantine system. But there's a devastating impact for our aviation sector if we don't resolve that soon. And look, we are going to have to wait a week or 10 days to find out whether or not they're still going to get support. So that's an unfortunate period of anxiety for businesses. We hope they're going to be supported in next week's budget, but I think it's really clear that for some of them, this will be later than they would have hoped for, and we have to be attentive to that.
Tony, we are moving from a system that's been a system of restrictions that's been administered on a regional to one that's been administered on a national basis. Clearly, the regional approach had its benefits. You could target measures where they needed to be, had its drawbacks, made it very difficult for certain parts of the country to ever move out of lockdown. What are your members saying about the fact that some parts of the country could be in a position to open up, if not entirely, then as close to that as possible, when others are not, and they're being dragged down essentially in terms of progress?
Look, I think for most businesses, certainly larger businesses, the huge level of complexity of regional tiering was not helpful. And what we still have is a degree of misalignment between devolved nations and England. And for businesses that are national, that's obviously an added complexity. Or if you're a business that operates across the Scottish-English border or the Welsh-English border, then there still being not quite enough alignment is still a complication. But I think on the whole, people will welcome the idea that there's a national system in place, at least for England, and they'll actually want more and more alignment through the next 6 to 12 months between all the devolved nations.
And Tony, just finally, we are all hoping that things return to some sense of normality in the not too distant future. But every business now has to build into their models the fact that COVID-19 will be circulating in the population for quite some time.
Yeah, that's right. Look, I think this announcement is very good news. There's an awful lot of detail to come if you are an employer, if you are running a business. First of all, as you say, there's the financial support that comes in part 2 of this announcement, i.e. the budget next week. There's then a whole set of workplace guidance we need to come back to. Remember the stuff about 1 meter or 2 meters. Remember about whether or not we can work from home or we can go into the office. And there's also quite a lot to put in place around a workplace testing regime, which has just been extended for businesses over 50 employees to the end of June, with the government supporting that. But I think you're right. We're going to be in a world of workplace testing for COVID for the next 12 months and beyond, because we'll have to keep an eye out for new variants. So businesses this morning will have pocketed last night's news. They'll have a broad framework in place, but they'll be wanting people like us to work with the government on much more detailed guidance for what reopening looks like. And as you say, for what living with the virus looks like, despite a world of hopefully complete vaccination or close to in the months ahead.
Tony Danker, Director General of the CBI. Good to see you this morning. Thanks for being with us. And we move straight to the Shadow Chancellor, Annalise Dodds, joining us, in fact, just a few metres away, just outside the Sovereign's entrance of the Palace of Westminster. Good to see you this morning, Ms Dodds. The Labour Party finds itself in something of a curious situation this morning as regards the roadmap. There are people on the Conservative benches, Steve Baker, a name that is constantly mentioned, who are far more diverged from the Prime Minister than the Leader of the Opposition this morning.
Well, we've consistently said that the government must follow the data, that they should be listening to scientists around reopening. And certainly it felt like we'd seen a real change from the Prime Minister yesterday, that he did seem to be focused on that evidence. We do have a number of concerns, however, I would say, about the approach of government, particularly the fact that we didn't have any clarity around business support when these changes were announced. It's the 4th time that has happened. But in terms of having a more gradual approach, when that's justified by the evidence, yes, we do think that's sensible.
Just on the assistance for business, of course, your focus will very much be on the budget, and of course some votes that you're trying to force through today. But when I spoke to the Health Secretary earlier, look, we all know what is happening in terms of furlough, what is due to happen in terms of furlough and in terms of rates assistance. We look at the roadmap and it directs us to the end of June. Surely now is the point at which the Chancellor could legitimately preempt the budget and say, do you know what, guys, we're going to extend furlough, we're going to extend rates assistance. I mean, what effect is his reluctance to do so having?
Well, the impact of this, unfortunately, is being meted onto individual businesses and many owners just essentially saying this stress is too much, that they cannot cope with having so much chopping and changing. And many weeks ago, we called on the Chancellor to be clear, particularly around the sunk costs that businesses have to pay. Business rates, for example, must be paid whether or not a business is in operation. And we don't have that clarity about whether the holiday will be continued. The direct impact of that is additional unemployment. We saw that back in the autumn when the Chancellor took so long to decide his position on furlough. I'm really concerned that we may well see that again because of his delays in announcing the situation for financial support now.
So tell us then just a little bit more, Ms Dodds, about the votes that you and your Treasury team colleagues are trying to push through today. In essence, it is trying to hold the government to account a little bit earlier than the date of the budget.
Well, that's right. And we really want to have that clarity for business as soon as possible. I talked to some individuals yesterday who were involved in the performing arts. Of course, the creative industries were a growing part of the UK economy before this crisis. They'll be critical for our recovery. And they were saying to me how they're looking forward to just a week of anxiety, yet more worry, because now they know there will be that long period when they won't be able to operate. Yes, of course, a chink of light that they may be able to be open into the summer, but until then, they don't know what the situation will be. And that really is causing, as I say, that additional unemployment. We've already had the worst economic crisis of any major economy in the UK. We cannot afford to have these delays in announcing economic support.
Last time we spoke, of course, we mentioned the fact that we're not regular clubbers. It's been quite a while since you and I have been hitting the nightclubs, but the nighttime industry is clearly of huge significance to the British economy. Is there no part of you that has slight concern? I mean, if we hit all the targets and hit all the goals, that, before July, we could see people congregating in sweaty, drunken nightclubs up and down the country with the concomitant effect that that might have on the R number?
Well, I have to say that overall, the hospitality industry worked incredibly hard to make sure that they were sticking to all of the public health requirements that were set out. I saw that myself last summer when I travelled all around the UK talking to different businesses, and it was clear they'd worked really, really hard to make sure that they were operating safely. Of course, critical to this into the future will be making sure that vaccination is rolled out at speed, that we still have those measures in place when they need to be there, and that we have a testing system and a self-isolation system that works. Now, particularly around self-isolation, we've got very, very low levels, unfortunately, of people saying that they are self-isolating when they need to. We've been pushing government over and over again to fix that, because unless we see people self-isolating to the extent that they need to, then we could see the disease continuing to spread, and obviously that could have a very big economic impact as well as a public health impact.
Annalise Dodds, thanks for joining us this morning.
Thank you.
Well, even with the new roadmap out of lockdown, there are thousands of businesses across the UK facing an uncertain future. Sky's Enda Brady is at a bar in central London for us this morning, and it looks like you're about to indulge in a little bit of the arrows, Enda.
In a moment, Neil. Yeah, we're in the Flight Club here in Victoria in central London. They've been pretty much shut for almost a year now. Let's bring in Steve Moore, who's the founder and chief exec. Steve, you've had a chance to read what the Prime Minister has said about reopening. What's your thoughts? How are you feeling?
Well, it's good and bad, isn't it? I suppose there's two parts to it. I think the May the 17th announcement was a bit of a shock and a bit of a kick to the sector massively. I think it's pretty brutal to sit so far behind non-essential retail, and especially because how safe all of hospitality has made it arguably safer than retail. So I think it would have been nice to be in line with those guys. So not so good there, and I think everybody's a little bit upset about that. However, the announcement, the potential reopening of everything proper in June the 21st is outstanding, I think, and that's pretty incredible with the vaccine. So some good, some bad.
How tough has it been? Lockdown. You've got a venue like this.
Yeah.
It's expensive, obviously, for rent and what have you, but slap bang in the heart of central London, a place that is normally very, very busy with people and customers.
Yeah, I mean, it's been brutal, really. I mean, like you said, for the last year, we've been shut for kind of 9 months of it. And I think, actually, even though the furlough scheme has been really good, a lot of the sectors really, really struggled with rent still, with, again, paying NI and pension contributions, all that. So everybody's been slowly going backwards. And then, obviously, it's been knocking out a fair amount of people going into bankruptcy. So for us, it's been incredibly tough, but been tougher for others.
Steve, we wish you the very best of luck with reopening. And Neil, I'll tell you what, when this place reopens, Scotland versus Ireland, let's get down here. Just bring in and just show you, so you can hire an Ockie by the hour here. And it really is a fantastic venue. And I'm just going to, just for the morning that's in it, Neil, everything's slowly getting back to reality. Let's end on a high note. And everyone here looking forward to May the 17th.
Yeah, I was going to say magic darts, Enda, but judging by your form, I'll just say, well, let's see what you could have won. Enda, we'll be back to you later on in the day. Let's turn our attention to events across the Atlantic, shall we? And President Joe Biden has led a minute's silence to honour victims of coronavirus after the country became the first in the world to record more than 500,000 deaths. Our US correspondent Cordelia Lynch reports.
Joe Biden's personal life is marked by tragedy. Now he oversees a country with more than 500,000 dead from COVID-19.
That's more Americans who've died in 1 year in this pandemic than in World War I, World War II, and the Vietnam War combined. That's more lives lost to this virus than any other nation on earth.
This is one of the last times that I think we were all together as a family.
Denny Taveras has seen generations of her family wiped out.
I've lost 6 individuals, 4 uncles and a brother and a half brother and his mother. And so it's been extremely devastating. I just didn't see. I didn't see it coming.
It hasn't been easy to cut through the grief. As a council member, she's had a community to care for. 80% of people in her area of Prince George's County in Maryland were born abroad, and they've been hit the hardest. Another diverse community in America that continues to suffer.
Here, a lot of people live in crowded homes. Many don't have health insurance, and they work in front-facing jobs that leave them particularly exposed. That's led to a disproportionate number of COVID cases and deaths.
Denny believes the system in the US is still freezing them out.
To me, the fact that we don't have a testing site in the zip code, we don't have a vaccine site in the zip code, to me speaks volumes.
Life expectancy fell by a full year in the US in the first 6 months of 2020. But the gap between black and white Americans is now at 6 years.
It's devastating, truly devastating. To me, it's part of the structural racism challenges that we continue to face.
Cases are going down, but this White House has a long way to climb, and it needs to move fast. Cordelia Lynch, Sky News, Maryland.
So, the UK now has a tentative plan for coming out of lockdown. But earlier, Matt Hancock told the programme it's not just about the decisions the government makes, it's how everybody responds. He said it's never been more important to stick to the rules. Lucy Beresford is a psychotherapist, and she joins us now from central London. Morning, Lucy. Always good to have you on the show. Let's talk a little bit about behavioural changes that may well have come as a result of COVID-19. How much of the way do you think that we've been behaving in lockdown and the distancing and the general fear of the outside world, how much of that is going to live with us for a long time?
Well, you're right to mention the fear because it's one of the key drivers to making behavioural change. But there is also an opposite driver, which is about being sociable, the pleasure principle that Freud talked about, and just in general, getting out there and living your life. So those two polarities, being anxious, being fearful, but also wanting to get out there, will be in tension with each other for some time to come. And what I mean by that is that for many people, the things that we've got used to doing, washing hands when we come in from outside maybe, or wearing a mask on social, on public transport or in a supermarket, those things will probably continue for quite a large number of people, because not only do they see the benefit in it for themselves, but they also see other people doing that behaviour. So we're very imitative creatures, and we often follow and copy other people. If we see them doing something, then we feel less embarrassed about doing it ourselves. But at the same time, I would expect that there will be such pent-up demand for people to reconnect, to perhaps do normal things like hugging people, perhaps even forming relationships, even having babies, things that have been very difficult when you've been separated from other people. Those are going to drive a different kind of behaviour. So those two things are going to be in tension the whole time for the next year at least.
Yeah, I mean, but that's the thing. I mean, so many of us have had to suppress our baser instincts, through periods of lockdown, if we were to stick within the rules. I suppose The question is how much of this is happening at the front of my brain and how much of it is happening way at the back without me knowing about it. I mean, which part of my brain is going to be in command come, June the 21st when I can do everything I want to?
Well, quite a lot of our primitive brain will kick in and say, well, hey, I think I can really have fun here. But it will also depend on whether you have been personally affected, which may affect your fear factor. There's quite a lot of debate at the moment around whether Boris Johnson's change of mood is as a direct result of the fact that he went through such a traumatic experience himself. And we know from research that our behaviour can change almost instantaneously if we have, for example, a very great shock. If someone says to you, if you don't stop smoking or if you don't lose weight, you are going to die, that can often be enough of a motivator to actually get you to change your behaviour. Otherwise, different research suggests that it takes about 2 to 3 months to embed new behaviour into your psyche. And as I say, things like wearing a mask, which normally the Brits wouldn't have done, but if you go to Asia, you see that that's a fairly typical thing to happen during the year. It could be that a lot of people, particularly if they've been directly affected by COVID, either they've had a very nasty physical experience of the disease themselves or sadly have lost a loved one, their behaviour may change much more radically.
Well, Lucy, I suppose we're going to see very, very soon if, of course, all those targets are met by the Prime Minister and by the country. Lucy Beresford, always great to have you on. Thanks for joining us this morning. Now, this is, frankly, the best bit of picture we have had, well, maybe all year. NASA has revealed remarkable video captured by the Mars Perseverance rover as it actually touched down on the red planet. Now, the footage shows the rover landing. This is the first time the manoeuvre has been seen. It landed last Thursday near an ancient river delta to search for signs of ancient microscopic life. That's pictures from Mars. It's amazing. Time to see how the weather is looking. Isabel is here. What have you got for us, Isabel?
A real contrast, Neil. It's looking pretty good in the southeast. Some mild weather, some sunshine, but a very different story elsewhere. Let's take a look.
Look forward to brighter skies. The weather, sponsored by Qatar Airways.
Wet and windy for northern and western areas. The Met Office has many warnings out for wind and rain, but the amber warnings across central and southern Scotland are of real concern, where we could well see between 80 and 120 millimetres of rain falling from midday to midday today to midday tomorrow. So it's getting on for about 5 inches worth, and that could well lead to some flooding issues. So it really is quite a poor story then, with a strong and gusty southerly wind, gusts in excess of 60, maybe 70 miles an hour at times for exposed areas, continuing to push this rain northwards and eastwards. You'll find, though, that a good chunk of East Wales, central and eastern England stays dry, though. Best of the sunshine in eastern and southeastern parts here, where temperatures will widely get up to about 13 or 14 degrees. Now, there will be some subtle changes tonight. The rain eases away from Ireland and central Scotland, but it continues to fall across the north and west of England and Wales. Still pretty gusty here. Mild for all of us tonight, and a really mild start when you step out tomorrow morning. The rain then slides away from Northumberland and Cumbria, but it does continue to affect Lancashire through the peaks, Wales and the southwest tomorrow. But otherwise, either side of that, not bad at all. Definitely a brighter picture to the northwest. The southeast, very mild, 14 to 16 with a little sunshine. Now, that front tends to weaken almost altogether by the time it reaches southeastern areas on Thursday, and then high pressure builds in, and we can promise a lovely end to the week. It really does look very nice. It'll be a little bit fresher in the early mornings as we head into the weekend. Touch of frost, maybe a little fog, but otherwise a fairly settled picture on the way.
The weather, sponsored by Qatar Airways.